that I have is about President Coolidge. How he was in office a matter of, am I correct, months, or was it?
He got basically the last year of
Okay,
Harding's, and then he will get reelected, as we'll see on.
okay.
Yeah. So
I was trying to get that placed in my mind as to how that all worked.
yeah, that's
Uh-oh. Russ, I accidentally muted you. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
me practice.
There you go.
Did it unmute me?
You were unmuted.
Okay. You know, when I separated that up, that was one reason why I was going essentially 21 through 23, 21 through 24 for last week's, and that's one of the reasons, because you have that change. And as I've always said, one of the most difficult thing on any of these classes is figuring out what do you leave out, as Bill will testify to with the Mark Twain class, or anybody that's ever done anything like this. What do you leave out? And of course, you guys know me. I don't want to leave anything out. I want to tell you everything. And to be honest, I feel like I'm leaving out tremendous amounts of things in this one. What I find amazing, that I guess, and I'm just talking before the class actually starts here, but what I find amazing to think about is, from the time I originally got interested in FDR, he was only 15 or 20 years gone at the time that I started researching him. And what fascinates me is that at that same time, the 1920s were the dark ages. The 1940s seemed like eons before. But, in the 1960s, the 20s were so far back there. Who could care? I mean, that's just ancient history, folks. And of course, I stop now and I think, well, 40 years is all. You take 40 years off today, and we're just talking Reagan, and that seems kind of like yesterday to me. Just one of those things that happens, and I suppose a lot of you feel that way. I don't know. I'm just kind of curious. But now, as I'm looking at the 20s, what is really amusing me is how familiar all of this sounds. And I swear none of it was said when I was taking any classes. The 20s got pushed off as the Roaring 20s, flappers, lots of things going on. They mentioned Teapot Dome, they mentioned the death of Harding. That was about it. And really, for a lot of years, I couldn't find good books on, and there still seems to be very few on Teapot Dome. And part of that, I think, it's really one of those sets of scandals that's much like the scandals we've become familiar with in our era, which, if you just stonewall it, you bury it long enough that really there's very few convictions. But when you look back on it, it is so obvious. And that's one of the things we're going to be looking at today. So welcome, everybody. It's time for the class. Let's see if I can get this. If you're ready, I'm going to try and share the screen again, Mara, and we'll see how it goes. All right, so I'm going to go right here, and I'm going to say, it's probably not the one I want to do. Let's go to this one. Share. Then I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to flip this. No, I'm not. It jumped on me. Hang on a second. Flip. You can do this. All right. Do we have it right?
Not yet. It's still showing the presenter.
Screen sharing is paused. Why would it be paused?
I am unsure. There we go. There we
All
go.
right, good.
We've got sports
Yeah, let's go
and
back.
style. Okay.
Welcome. Remembering the 1920s. We're moving into the next section, which is 1924 to 1927. And I want to talk about lawlessness. And as I said in the catalog, not just in the streets. And this is something a little different for America. You know, we might think of the Wild West and things like that, but there's different things going on here. So just to remind you, some of the things that we've seen is style is changing. And we talked about the fact that we had sports and why were sports so big? Why did they suddenly become so much more exciting? People have a lot more time. They have radios, they have newspapers they can read. Why do they have more time? In the late, in the late 1919s, there were a number of strikes. The strikes actually were not shut down immediately by the government, which had been happening frequently before this. And what that had meant was they actually got to the point where they had bartered for an 8-hour day. They had started to make inroads on child labor. They had started to make inroads on a number of things, minimum wages and those types of deals. So suddenly they've got more time. You've got radio now, and sports stars are getting coverage. And they're getting coverage in the papers because people like to read it. And remember, I've been talking, and last week's whole point was that the 1920s are very much a reaction to everything that had come before. And remember, you'd had the terrible disappointment of rigged sporting events, specifically the World Series in 1919. And you needed something to revive them. Of course, along came Babe Ruth in 1920 to be there for radio, to be there for everything, and to hit that astounding number of homers. So there were so many things going on, but everything is about the reactions. But also remember, we've got different things going on, and I like to always tie this in. We're into the mid 1920s, and remember, there's a building being started in downtown Sioux City. It's called the Badgerell Building, and they call it's going to be the monarch of our city. It's this awesome 12-floor building, a high-rise in Sioux City. And note the style. It's in that Art Deco style. And I was lucky enough to have an office for a while in the Badgerell Building before they closed it down in the early 2000s. And I have to tell you, I enjoyed every minute of it. And I loved when they remodeled it, they brought back a lot of the Art Deco features or saved them. So, if I get a chance to talk about it, to say anything about it, it is one of those phenomenal buildings. I'm very, very hopeful that it soon will be back open to everyone. Now, I normally ask you what you learned last week, and some of you have mentioned if you feel comfortable enough to unmute, if you can tell me something you learned last week, that would be great. Anybody? Otherwise, just be talking. I'm going to briefly just cover a couple of things. Here's that timeline that we talked about last time. Just to remind you, you got that huge growth in radio stations. You've got newspapers and especially magazines now with their longer articles becoming opinion makers. We went up through late or mid 1923. So one of the things I talked about last week was that Prohibition failed. And one of the big things I want to say about that is, as I mentioned, and I told you that I knew that there was a drastic drop. Now, this drastic drop is just from the buildup that had gone before that in the 1900s or so. But alcohol consumption per capita fell by about a gallon through the entire Prohibition era. So it really did work. And alcohol-related diseases and accidents also declined. So it did what it set out to do. But one of the things that I was talking about was we have to make sure we tell the whole story, because obviously as a policy, it certainly failed. And the big issue is it was embraced by millions, but mostly those were Protestant churchgoers, the women that had been behind the temperance movement, things like that. And it was flouted by millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens, and that led to a lot of terrible issues. And of course, those biggest issues were increased pressure on police in an effort to curb the sales, but also the entire issue of corruption that will become so prevalent, bribery and bribes with it. So it's always important. What I mentioned last week that I was really trying to push, we need to make certain we hear the whole story. And it may not be just the part of the story that matches the frame you want to put around it. Realize that what's important to get the right frame is to know all of it. So a little later tonight, we're going to be talking about part of that real failure of prohibition and some of the things it caused. Now, I said the 1920s were all about reaction. I mentioned that, last week I mentioned that, boom, you've got income taxes cut. Actually they're saying, no, we don't really think this is right. They cut those drastically on the businesses and on people. You get the 8-hour workday is immediately struck down and thrown out. Remember, you've got a freedom for contract. That's in the Constitution. And by gosh, just because you, the laborer, also have a freedom contract, that doesn't mean that the government should say, oh, we're going to defend the worker over the business. Instead, we're going to defend the business over the worker. It's a constant, and it had been that way throughout American history. And labor unions, which had gotten the right to strike and had built closed shops, meaning that you had to be a union member to work there, that got thrown out. So their ability to strike and negotiate is greatly curtailed, and it's not going to come back strongly until the Great Depression. So questions for you to think about tonight. If Harding's presidency rolled back business regulations and enacted immigration control and protective tariffs, why is his presidency considered to be one of the worst? And what is the issue with high tariffs, and especially high tariffs in the 1920s? Why is that such a bad deal? Because really, we're going to see them escalate even farther, and I'll get to that a little later. So we need to know, what's the problem with high tariffs, or why is it a problem at this point being the 1920s in America? What's the big issue behind that? And also, I was always told that Americans disengaged from Europe and world affairs after World War I. They all backed away completely. Is that true? It's that whole story issue that I want to make sure we're getting. So is that true is one of our questions. Now, we discussed that the 1920s, reacting to changes, and we talked about those changes. Well, I didn't make clear this, but during those last years of the Harding administration, actually from the moment he started, they started pushing back on immigration. It had been decreased due to the Great War, but when immigration levels started to reach the pre-war levels, it hit 800,000 new people coming in 1922. Congress caved to the public and said, all right, you're right. We're gonna close down on immigration. Remember, they'd already been rounding up everybody they felt was a radical, and giving them no due process, essentially just shipping them out of the country. We called those the Palmer raids. But here is a shot of Ellis Island, which had come online in the 1890s, just as a place to check people in, to have them be counted as they came in, and more importantly, just to check them for diseases. Those were the only real rules that you had to pass to get through Ellis Island in those pre-days. Because what's going to happen? Remember, 1922, you're getting your first ever national immigration policy. Prior to this, it was all up to the states to decide who became a citizen of that state. And by being a citizen of that state, you're now a citizen of the United States. But of course, we'd also had terrible problems because, first, we did not recognize citizenship for Black slaves that became freed. Only states north of a certain line would consider doing that, and not all of them. And what rights that included were not necessarily national. So you fight an entire civil war about that. You pass 2 or 3 constitutional amendments to try to clarify what it means. And then you finally pass another one just that comes into effect in 1920 to give women those rights of citizenship. So now all of a sudden, now Congress is involved in deciding who's a citizen. So one of the things that I always have to laugh at is the minute somebody says to me, well, my parents followed the rules, or my great grandfather followed the rules and came into this country and did it legally. I, of course, am always thinking, is that before 1922? Because there were no rules before 1922. You just showed up. And by the way, the rule that will get passed here in 22, the biggest part of it that remains in effect at that time and would continue forward to at least toward the 1960s, was no Asians, essentially no Orientals. They just completely locked them down. And then everything else that what passes to start with is just a cut in the numbers. But excuse me, by 1924, what happens is they decide we're going to limit those numbers first to 165,000 a year. And then as of July of, I think, 27, it will go to 150,000 a year. And it will stay at that number until roughly 1965. All of these rules stay in effect. And the way they did it was they also said, they essentially passed 2 sets of rules, one which limits the numbers, second one which limits who can get in. And essentially that was designed to make it that they didn't want Southern Europeans or anywhere south of that, and they didn't want anybody on into what they considered the dangerous zone of the old Russian and other areas on further. So what they were trying to do, of course, was limit non-white access, and that's the whole point of it. They wanted Northern Europeans, and they wanted to get away from other items. And here's one of the reasons. When I said they caved to citizen demand, it is the citizens. It was a reaction to looking around and seeing people that didn't look necessarily like them. Remember, Italians were ostracized, which is, almost amusing today. They were angry about the Irish, but they really couldn't say anything. The thing they had against the Irish is they were Papists. They were Catholics, and that was hugely offensive. So you have this anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, and anti-Black feelings, and that basically became the new calling card for the Ku Klux Klan, which really had experienced a rebirth since the start of the 1900s. And the Ku Klux Klan was somewhat embraced by, as I'd mentioned last time, by the Wilson White House. So these things are frightening when we think about them because they were just out in the open. It was, for many people, they saw this as a positive thing. And by the 1920s, that appeal had spread all over the US, and rural and small towns, which were mostly white Protestant, took up the banner and were thrilled to do so because they saw it as a religious calling. And um, it spread throughout the plains. You don't see it so much. I don't find much of a history of it in Nebraska. We can see things. You can see I have pulled up this with helpful North Dakota out of the mud. And of course, famous writers for that time wrote a great deal about how sad they were that the Klan had taken over their hometown in Kansas or something like that. What really happens, it's not just the rural small towns, it's very much exactly what we were seeing then. It was a base message, pitching white values. And really, they were preaching hate as a patriotic virtue. What happened was the Klan became a very powerful sub-political group that had a lot of power in rural state houses because they could run people against who was running, somebody who was running that did not embrace their values. So this is a scary time for America. They were claiming it as a holy cause, and they were pushing the Protestant renewal side of it, and they were openly anti-Catholic. They were openly extremely anti-Jewish. So, and that's because change scares people, and immigrants represented change. And we see that throughout American history. You can go and look that anytime you have a high level of immigration, especially if those people are going to be coming into already populated areas, you will find a backlash of sorts. And you will find if their political party does not answer that, a new political party will end up being formed. And recall through the 1850s, you had the destruction of the Whig Party because it would not embrace this concept. And you then had two separate groups come through that to basically push this together to say, we're going to turn around and say no. We've got a Republican Party that's going to embrace the idea of that it's all right, but you've got the know nothings. Why were they called the know nothings? Because they didn't. They were pushed. It was pushed back if they said they were just openly anti-immigration. But 1920s, it's all on the table because you've got all of the issues we talked about last week with the essentially the embrace of the concept that there is a desire to have a white history, white group of people coming in, and a lot of that's in response, of course, to the Great Migration, where the blacks are moving out of the South into the populated areas in the North. So remember, there's a lot of change going on here. Let's see. First, a lot of change. Well, I have to back up now that it finally went. So the changes, and I mentioned these last week, innovation and inventions. This has changed everything in American business by this point. And that is bringing huge change, but most people are finding it good, except that if you find yourself being put out of work because of an innovation or an invention, it didn't feel so good. But there was enough work that in most cases there just wasn't they weren't hiring new people. Um, as I said last time, work is starting to contract a little bit because there's not as much growth, but by not bringing in new people, they're able to place somebody who's got this job that's being outmoded into that. So it's not quite a mass layoff. But you have the total difference of people who were for the temperance movement and people who were not, and thus you end up with bootlegging. So these are dynamics that are slamming into each other. We've got that rural versus urban still going on, and most of that is about religion, and not so much because the cities are still openly religious and for the most part openly Protestant. They just are not as rigorous about it, or I should say, probably not taking it as verbatim. They're saying we embrace religion, but we're not saying everything that the Bible says is specific. So, the fundamentalism versus the more wide open religious issues are happening, but rural versus urban, you're seeing a tremendous change because of the nature of business. Factories in the urban areas, farms, and shopkeepers in the rural areas. A divergence, a big divergence. Women's rights versus community morals. And we talked about that last time. Every time women change their hairstyle, when women change their clothing, when types, to go from skirts to pants, oh my gosh, we can't do that. Oh my gosh, you want to cut your hair, you're starting to look like a man. You must want to take on work like men. You don't have the same moral value we have, and it becomes a clash. Business taking control, that's always a huge clash. Whichever one is in ascendancy, bang, got quite a smash there between labor and the things it wants, and business and the things it wants to do. So, and then we've already talked about the race riots, immigration reform, all of these changing, feeding the Ku Klux Klan revival. So, and I see my spelling check wrote Klan for me. So, all right. So, just a couple of things here. We talked about this a little bit. We settled on Roaring 20s, but it's also known as the Jazz Age. It's also been given the name the time of bathtub gin. But one that was pushed for heavily in the 1920s, because again, this was another change. The adults wanted to call it the era of the inflamed youth, because these kids are just so up in arms about everything. Everything is so dramatic and everything is so special. We settled on roaring because the music was roaring, and we saw that. And in the cities, parties and dances were big issues for that. Jazz was providing that music, and the freedom expressed by that music and some of the song lyrics scared a lot of people. And the method of dancing, that totally out of control type look, or worse yet, I don't know, those cheek to cheek dances, we're not sure that's a good thing. There were other aspects of the dancing that might have been very popular in the cities, but maybe not so popular in the rural areas. But the music enthralled the youth, and dancing also, whether it was fast or slow, became a craze. So between Charleston, the foxtrot, anything. But again, it's mostly in the cities, mainly because an outfit like this in rural America would not only draw glares, it would probably bring your father out to get you. But flappers became the rage. There were young women flocking to the cities so that they could bob their hair, live free, wear shorter dresses, have an exciting life. They were inflamed with the things that needed to be done and that they were there to do. They were asserting their right to live free. Well, we can't allow that. That's just not right. Thus, you start regulating what's allowed in public. There's that perfect example of it. In fact, the idea that women smoke in public, there are people that took them, you can't do that. But, by late 1919, it became a law recognized that it's not a crime for women to smoke in public. So there you go. I'm sure Elsie Peterson, who was arrested for smoking in the Times Square subway, was very thankful that the Supreme Court actually saw it her way. But the point is, women were starting to, there was at least a significant number that said, we have achieved the vote. We want to go on and achieve our rights. But you got to be careful, because as you can see, it might go beyond just what they wear or the fact that they want to smoke. They might want to go wear tighter clothes, pants, might even want to go to work. Now, the reality is, and I know the word I'm dancing around here is sex, because that too becomes a huge issue. And that is the issue behind all of this. The problem is they might want to be a vamp. And yes, that name is straight off the word vampire. They put newspapers and magazines started to warn everyone of the dangers of vamps. Vamps were liberated women who embraced the dancing, and they believed in daring fashion, had openly seductive behavior, which might lead to a seduction, and it was all associated with jazz. Now you know why jazz was such a threat. So that roar you were hearing might be the rural regions of America outraged by what's happened. That's the other reason it might be the roaring 20s, because they were outraged. Do we ever hear anything like that? Do we ever hear, think of the things we've talked about just so far this hour. Gosh, we've got these things that other people are doing and I don't like it. We hear that all the time today, don't we? We do. So now the economy was roaring for some. It was certainly roaring for these three. Anybody know them? It's Henry Ford, some guy named Edison, and Firestone. Why is Firestone so important? Because he's making the tires that allow Ford to run all of those cars. And of course, Edison and
Russ?
yes.
This is Linda. I want to tell you that my screen is not updating. I still have the 1920s innovations and inventions screen up. Nothing else has come up since then. I don't know about anybody else.
Hey, anybody else? Get somebody to.
Yeah, this is Ed and Cindy. Ours still says that as well.
Yep. Same here.
Interesting. Mine. Huh. All right, what I'm going to do for a moment, let's see that. You are screen sharing, and let's see if it took it.
Yeah, now I have the one with Ford, Edison, and Firestone.
Yay.
Yeah, same here.
Okay, thank you. Please
You're
feel
welcome.
free to speak up, and thanks for that. I appreciate it. I can see something here that'll let me know that, so I will try and watch for it as well. So thank you. So as I was saying, Firestone, of course, is providing the tires, and he's able to do that because he's adopted many of these new innovations that Ford has come up with a chain delivery of the product to the person so that they could work on it in their spot all the things we've become familiar with since then, which was making him tremendously valuable to getting all these cars. Because remember, Ford's car sales are going through a huge growth period. And he, by the end of the decade, he will hit 5.5 million in sales in 1929, which, means at that point, 1 out of every 27 people in America, owned a car, and that would not be seen again until 1950 to have that kind of penetration rate for car sales. So, it's a very big deal. Business was benefiting as well from reduced regulations. Remember, I said they wiped out most of the taxes and regulations. And then at the same time, they'd convinced Congress to put a high tariff on European goods. And what that meant was European goods just became too expensive for Americans to buy. Now, here's one of the problems with that. It was very effective. It said, no, the Europeans can't sell their goods here. We want to buy American goods. All fine and well, except remember, Europe is still trying to rebuild their lives and their destroyed countryside after the Great War. More importantly, though, Germany and all the European nations, the Allies as well, Germany has reparation payments that are outrageous that they have to pay, but the Allies all owe us money. The United States went from being the greatest debtor nation in the world to the greatest loaning nation in the world. More people owed us money than any other country. And what that meant was these Europeans could not sell their goods here. We're the ones that have the money. Suddenly, the Europeans cannot pay us for the things they bought to survive through World War I. And by the same token, Germany now is suddenly struggling because they can't pay their reparation payments that they're mandated to pay by the armistice. So, this isn't well thought out. It's making it very hard. And what America actually does is they go out and they rework all the loan payments to make it a little easier. And what we're going to find is it's just too easy to slap on tariffs, and they will do it again by the end of the decade. And that's going to play right, essentially we're going to do that because we're sliding into the Depression. Well, what's going to happen is thus we're going to export the Great Depression to the rest of the world by forcing them into a depression since they can't sell anything. But that's yet to come. So with these high tariffs, there are side pieces to it that we have to take into account. Now, under cases where if you buy the goods anyway, remember the tariff is going to be paid by the people who eventually buy the products made with that item. So different circumstances there, but in this case, at this point, it definitely unbalanced a very tricky balancing act that was happening with Europe at this point. But remember, in our case, all of these things that we just talked about, the tax reductions and the tariffs and the other issues, is only helping half the country. Farming was already in a depression. The Europeans were growing more goods so that they did not have to buy them from us, and we did not have anything else that was going to come from that. High tariffs meant the Europeans could not sell in America, so they had no money, so they couldn't buy our goods, our farm goods, even if they wanted to. So that just contributed further to the farmers' problems. And remember, when I say farming's having a problem, farming takes care of all the rural areas. All the jobs in the rural areas depend on farming being healthy. So half the jobs in the country are fed off of farming. You've got all these small towns that depend on it that are suddenly sliding into a crisis. It's kind of a slow slide for a lot of them, but it's there. And I've got these different towns listed here. This one is Alpha, Minnesota. You saw the previous one was Powell, Wyoming. This one is called Locktown, Jersey. These are all from the early 1920s to mid 1920s, the very time we're talking about. And this one is Virginia, Damascus, Virginia. Notice all of them, you see a car or two, not many. In almost all cases, you don't see all that much of an improvement on the roadway. Excuse me, this one is from Mosa, South Dakota. It's a little later. It's 1927. Notice all the cars. It's a Sunday gathering outside the church and a lot of cars. Now, also remember when I say that half the people are involved in farming, we have to remember it's still just like today. That's still about 80% of the country in land size. In other words, everything outside the big cities. But exactly what had happened, this is normalcy, it prevails. Well, these new business laws didn't do anything to help the farmer, but they were able to at least say by doing tariffs, since no one understands exactly how those work, that, hey, we did something for you, we did these tariffs. And rural areas had always distrusted immigration. Remember, it's the cities and the factories that wanted the cheap labor that immigration represented. Now, we'd gotten to this last week. We had said that suddenly at the end, we have the death of the president. I just want you to see where we have experienced this in our lifetimes. We know what happens when a president suddenly dies in office unexpectedly. And the outpouring that comes from that, and and the complete remorse that washes over the country, and people thinking about this person that they knew because they read about them every day. Remember, he had fallen ill. They put out reports saying, oh, it looks like he's coming back from it, and then boom, just suddenly dies. And Calvin Coolidge, the guy that really is so quiet nobody's even noticed him, suddenly has to step up to become president. Now, I put these other items in here. We've got things that will remind us of times that we certainly are familiar with, and that outpouring of people and all those folks on the road that are escorting them. He was greatly beloved. He was considered, he'd won by about 60% of the vote. He was thought to be a genuine nice guy, but there are changes coming. His legacy becomes completely undone as the facts unfold after his death. And of course, this rock might look familiar to you. It's called Teapot Rock. And with that, the problem becomes very obvious very shortly. We had talked about it last time that what is coming into the open is that there are just some incredibly not well hidden scandals that are just out there waiting to be found. And part of the problem is Harding had just appointed, he had appointed 3 very good people that we discussed before, Hoover being primary among them, Wallace, some others. He also appointed guys that were basically just old cronies that he trusted. And those were people who were only there because they wanted wealth. They didn't want the wealth that they were supposedly going to get by working the job. They wanted it by working an angle. And remember that, in his discussion with Hoover toward the end, Harding had said, "I'm not fit for this office and I should never have been here." The problem is, these scandals unfold, it becomes very clear that he's likely right. His presidency goes down on record as being possibly more corrupt than Grant's. And people are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, saying that, like Grant, he did not know these things were there and that he simply trusted people he shouldn't have. The reality is, Harding only made it into office in the fact that he had Doherty as his fixer, who had set everything up for him at the convention when they were deadlocked. And Doherty didn't do it just for Harding to become president, but for Doherty to be able to gain something out of Harding becoming president. So there's always that. Now, we also have to remember that his vice president, Coolidge, really probably wanted less to do with the presidency than any man alive. Remember, he's back home asleep at his father's house when, I would say, the call comes, but it can't be a call. It's a knock at a door, because his father didn't believe in telephones and they'd never put one in. They had to come and wake him up. His father was a justice of the peace, brings out the Bible to swear him in. The key thing is, whether he was all that smart or not is hard to judge. He definitely is taciturn. That's a good word for it. But we do get the distinct feeling he's honest. And from the very start, he backs the full investigation of the Teapot Dome scandal, because that was already, remember, Harding had an inkling that this was already starting to break, because things were starting to unravel. The entire transfer of these oil reserves meant for the Navy and for the US were being transferred to two oil companies almost openly, in no bid contracts. So when the investigation is called for, Coolidge just says, get it out. Just get it all out. He had nothing to do with it and just felt go right ahead. Now, Doherty, one of the problems for Doherty is, while Fall may have only had this deal going on, Doherty had hundreds of things in his past that were suspicious, and had been appointed Attorney General of all places. He gets put in charge of justice. He has so many skeletons in his closet, he's hard pressed to remember all of them. And that makes it pretty tough. But as we will see, he guts it out. Albert Fall, on the other hand, was the Secretary of the Interior, and he had left before Harding's death, but he's going to become the first cabinet member to serve prison time. He's convicted for taking $400,000 in bribes from oil interests. That's got to be probably over $1 billion in today's money, just to swing the no bid, no royalties lease of oil reserves to these two companies. And remember, that had all been set up and probably would have been done smarter had Hammond, the guy who originally thought the entire deal up, had he not died, he probably had it figured out to do it and cover it well. Fall just liked the idea, and even though Hammond was gone, said, yeah, we're just going to go forward with this, and trusted that he could just schmooze everybody into not paying attention to it. Doherty had been a key player in it, and he's going to be forced out of the cabinet under Coolidge when Coolidge realizes that he looks pretty shady anyway. But the truth is, he's got his fingers in so many other money scams, but he will manage to not be convicted of anything. Now, you may ask how that could happen. I will mention there was one mysterious death, one suicide, and another supposed suicide where the guy shot himself without being the person who shot himself, but it gets ruled as a suicide as well. So there's a lot of things that happen to fix this entire scandal. It's not enough to save Fall, but it gets everybody else off. The oilmen will be found innocent of bribery, even though Fall is found guilty of taking a bribe from one of them in the oilmen's trials. They're found innocent of bribery, even though it was Donnie's son who would bring at least 100,000 of the money in a doctor's valise to Fall and deliver it to him in his office at the executive building at the Capitol. So now Sinclair does not get off scot-free. He gets held in contempt of court because in fighting everything, he had members of the jury followed. He had all the investigators followed. It is believed he got a hung jury at one point. It's believed that that might have been involved by finding out who was on his jury. But anyway, while nothing in the investigation showed Harding had anything to do with the scandals, and while nobody would speak ill of the dead, the silent charge of incompetence stuck throughout his life. Harding, who had been so popular in his time in office, has continued to fall in the presidential polls until there's almost no further than he can fall. If it weren't for the Civil War breaking out, he would have replaced that guy on the bottom. So I mean, it's quite a precipitous fall, because originally when he first died, they thought pretty highly. So what's the legacy of Teapot Dome? Well, one thing to remember, even though by 29, I think, the Supreme Court revokes all the leases and it all reverts back to the American public's holding of that land, the federal government holding it. All the oil they could pump out in those 4 or 5 years is still gone, and it was sold, and it easily covered their costs in this. So the legacy of it becomes one that you can fight these investigations, and we will see that over and over again then going forward. One of the things Fall had done was, after pushing it off as long as he could, he got his fellow, he came from the Senate before he went into the cabinet, he got fellows that liked him to delay them as long as they could. And then when he was finally required to provide certain pieces of paper and other evidence, he dumped 6,000 pieces of paper on their desks. He pushed back and pushed it off as long as he could, hoping against hope that he could survive it. He didn't. He would actually do the prison time. But through all this, Coolidge, his entire part in this was simply saying, no, I want you to get it out. And then later, while they were still debating and they were saying there should be something like a special prosecutor, he convinced one Democrat, one Republican, both of whom were known to be very good investigators / prosecutors, and got both of them to step in and act as a joint prosecution to investigate these. And that really, those two items, saying it must go forward and then putting 2 people on the job to do it, that was the sum total of his involvement, because he didn't like being involved. In fact, people would say to him that he seems distant, and his return line to them was, "I've found if you ignore people and don't talk to them, they will go away." And he would do that in his office as president. If they came in to talk to him, he would ignore them if he just didn't want to talk to them. And he would ignore them long enough that most of them would go away. Now, we've said that America had disengaged from the world, but I want you to realize that there were a number of people, and Hughes being one of them, Charles Hughes, who had actually originally been on the Supreme Court for a while and only came back when his party had asked him to run for the presidency in 1912. He actually is in charge at state, and they are actively trying to figure out ways to avoid another great war. Remember, they had turned down the concept of the Treaty of Versailles, and they had turned, which had stipulations that would entangle America in their thought process with Europe. And they had also said they didn't want to have part in these other items, but they did go out and work for treaties to try universal disarmament. They felt that a lot of the reasons that the Great War happened was because both sides became armed camps, both sides continued to build up their arsenals, both sides continued to build up their troop levels. And so what the United States tried to broker were treaties that would mutually agree to not building up to these levels. And one of the things that they were trying very hard to do was to get rid of what they called the capital ships, the battleships, these great behemoths that ruled the ocean, trying to get people to draw down the forces so that they would not break out another war. Also mutually assured defense agreements and things like that, but not with us. We wanted to avoid that. They disliked, you remember, World War I got triggered because of those mutual agreements. Oh, if France goes to war, then Russia has to come in, or vice versa. And all of those things, which led to a tripwire. They tried to get rid of all of that, instead make it that the groups would try to work together to prevent somebody from building up an army. It was a good idea, and it was a plan, and in reality, somewhere in the mid-1920s, they actually, I believe it's the Kellogg-Briand Pact that essentially outlawed war, and everybody was very proud of that they had figured out a way to outlaw war. Of course, it didn't have a chance in hell of working, but it sounded good. And it was a way to avoid spending money on a standing army, which America, up to World War II, always believed was something you did not do. Now remember, I've been talking about all the cars that are being built, the cars that are going out there. And I mentioned last time that cars are also being blamed for allowing young people to engage the passions of youth because they're able to get away from mom and dad. Remember, courting used to be you went to mom and dad's house to meet the girl and you sat in the parlor. Well, now there are other things, and that's part of the problems with dances and everything else. And F. Scott Fitzgerald would write very humorously about all this, that poor cars and dances and all these things are being unfairly blamed for the passions of youth. So, but cars do make a difference. They do start changing things. And cheap prices for the cars and easy credit, I'm not sure why the word teapot ended up in there, but easy credit made these purchases very possible. And Ford proved that. Remember, the entire concept that's keeping America afloat right now is that there's enough Americans who have money to buy things that then in turn keeps things rolling. Now, we're familiar with that today, but remember, at this time, it's really the big ticket items that keep the majority of people involved and employed. So in other words, it's your steel mills, it's all of those pieces. But remember as well, there's no war going on, so and they've built the railroads. Now we're moving over to cars. Well, we need some steel, but we don't need it anywhere near as much as we did for the railroad. Certainly not as much as we did in building up tanks and these big ships. So production has been on the downtrend. There's production of cars, there's production of radios, but not as much production going on, and it's decreasing. But what's actually happening is the number of items still being turned out is continuing to increase because of productivity methods that are being found, those innovations we spoke of. So production is still maintaining or going up, but the number of workers is not increasing. One thing that does need work, however, are roads, because all they are dirt paths. They were fine for horses, they're okay for wagons, but now that cars are coming, cars weigh a lot more, not so good. You need a lot of work. And as you can see, here's somebody trying, kind of like they did with coaches. We had to get a big stick and we're trying to get this out of here, and note the rope on the front. You can bet that's tied to a team of horses, and they're trying to pull this out. Roads need a lot of work. It's very interesting because one book I'd read some time ago now, it's called The 20th Century Journey. The guy is from Iowa, and he talks about he's leaving Iowa to go to Chicago, to catch a train to go to New York so that he can catch a boat to go to Europe. And it's 1921. And he talks about how many times his uncle has, one of these cars, and they're thinking it's all going to be great. He talks about how many times along the way, just to get through Iowa, that they have to wake a farmer to get a team of horses to pull the car out so that they can keep going. Roads were terrible. Now here is one of those things, one road that gets designated that is going to be the road across America. It's going to go here from Omaha to Chicago to Philadelphia. This is the Lincoln Highway, which for our time followed pretty much Highway 30. And it's kind of a nice picture here to see how this works. And we can see why, some of those roads that we see exits for are still there, even though the towns may or may not. That book I was telling you about, that 20th Century Journey, was by William Schreier, and he's a young college newspaper writer from Cedar Rapids. He's a co-college graduate. And like a lot of, he gets out of college, and before he goes to work, he wants to spend the 3 months of summer over in Europe. That's what he's going to do, see if he can find a job there. He works a cattle barge for the transit, which he talks about being just as disgusting as you would think it would be to go across the Atlantic on that. But as he said, once he got there, to be 21, fresh out of Iowa, alone, utterly free, and with a job in Paris in the mid-20s, it was heaven for him. He thinks back on it, up till his death, going, this is so incredible. Now, you may recall William Schreier. He was a prominent newsman. He was he would move from newspapers. He would work for a newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, while he's over there, and also the Paris Tribune. But he would eventually move his way over to work at CBS Radio while he's in Europe. He left Iowa to go to Europe for 3 months. It would be 20 years before he makes it back. So now, before we continue with him, he also has a few statements to make. He watched followed the proceedings, the Scopes monkey trial from afar. He had a hard time with that because he had always been a Williams Jennings Bryan fan, but his father and as a child, he had also met Clarence Darrow, the opposing side, and to come on to defend Scopes on that charge. Remember what the charge is? Scopes is very quickly forgotten. Scopes was the guy that gets arrested because Tennessee had said, you can't teach Darwinism, you can't teach evolution in schools. You have to teach the Bible in the public schools. And Scopes gets forgotten because the entire courtroom battle becomes so famous, so written about, because of the battle going on that's really between rural and urban, between the fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible, which is a very strict interpretation of it, and the forces on the other side that are saying, we can still believe the Bible, but we don't have to believe that all of these things happen just and only this way. This battle will be written about, remembered, and be talked about for years. The irony is, of course, what it comes down to is it will be the last gasp for the man who had been the face of the progressive movement in America for so many years, Williams Jennings Bryan. But Clarence Darrow, who actually kind of liked Bryan, made a fool out of him, mocking him in that. But what's not remembered or realized is that the fundamentalists did not believe that Bryan lost, and it's just another mark of that widening gap between the rural and urban areas. Now, we've talked a little bit about literature. One of the people I have not mentioned is Sinclair Lewis, who, of course, goes on to really show us, small town America as we knew it at the time. And he would become, a Pulitzer Prize winner for his works. He's also got Babbitt in here that I'm not showing, Arrowsmith, Main Street. And these still spoke to me when I read them. These were published in the 20s, but they certainly still sounded very, very familiar to me growing up in a small town in America, as he recounts that youth looking to get out beyond the small town, the boosterism in Babbitt, or the incestuous nature of Main Street. Arrowsmith, the idea that think you've got it all figured out, really, fate and life will, of course, still take a hand. Sinclair Lewis was, certainly is a genius writer, and would go on to write Elmer Gantry, where, of course, he's talking about the religious aspects. And, toward World War II, he also writes It Can't Happen Here, looking at the things that brought the Nazis to power in Germany, and saying, well, really, why it could happen here, and what method it would happen. There's certainly nothing that he wrote in that hasn't felt true since then. Now, we had mentioned Hemingway last time, but the reason I'm mentioning these, isn't this the connection we still have? Hemingway, Lewis, as we'll see in a little bit, F. Scott Fitzgerald, these guys are all still read today. And their work still speaks to us today. And remember, the movies from the 20s, because they were silent movies, had a tremendous impact on people then, but not so much on us now. They have not come down as far, but these writers still do. And, you know, one of the things that Sinclair Lewis was saying, you know, is what you heard in those books was every kid, if he was in a small town, wanted to get to the city. And if he was in a city, he perhaps wanted to get to Europe, which of course is part of what happened. If they're in rural America, they felt and were going to be anything, they had to get into the big city. They had to have that freedom. And of course, the other thing that we mentioned, what was happening with women, it wasn't just the men that were saying, I need this freedom. It's the women as well. Remember, Hemingway is a newspaper writer. He writes with a lot of them, but he wrote a lot with the Kansas City papers, and would go on to go to Europe. And at this point, he's about to publish The Sun Also Rises, which still is a, you know, pitch perfect description of what some of these inflamed youth are going through. But it also gives us that look into the group that have experienced the Great War and the disillusionment that comes with it. Now, you know, remember the fascinating thing that Schreier talks about, because he meets all these people while he's over there, and they haven't become the big names they will become, but they're on the edge. They're, you know, Sinclair Lewis has already written and is known, but he works with this guy named James Thurber at the paper that he's working at. He goes out and meets this guy named Hemingway that everybody, Ezra Pound, this great poet, is saying, no, when Hemingway finishes and publishes his new book, The Sun Also Rises, he will be lauded as possibly the best prose writer of this new generation. He was right. He was right. And, you know, it continues on. And of course, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who had done, you know, a couple of books prior to this, and held up and down, suddenly comes out and produces The Great Gatsby, which still to this day is our record of what we think of, you know, during that era. And of course, here's the house where, quote unquote, Gatsby was staying. This was the house that he based that on. You know, look at the immense wealth that a house like that would cost in Long Island on the beach. I mean, that's just incredible to think about. It's the 1920s. That's the other thing that we've already talked about, the gap between the rural and the cities, but now realize within those cities, you've got the very, very poor. You've got the ones that are the working people. You've got a very few that are moving along to become and be the middle class that we're coming to know it as, you know, during our generation. But then you have the super wealthy, you know, those 200 people who own perhaps 80% of everything in America at that point. And that doesn't count some of them that own a lot of it that nobody can track. And of course, we've seen this picture in the statement before. It's Al Capone saying, "I'm simply a businessman." And remember, we have embraced business. What's Coolidge say? Coolidge says the business of America is business. Here's Capone saying, "I'm simply a businessman. I'm just supplying my customers with what they need." Well, here's the thing to remember about that. You know, alcohol consumption is down overall, but it's very, very much higher in the cities. But you have your markets within those cities. And as a business, you either protect those markets or you're going to lose that market, lose the business. Now, the thing is, difference with Capone and the people he did business with is that a hostile takeover isn't done with ballots based on the number of shares you have. It's done with bullets. And as we see, the massacre of the gang, that, it's a constant. And if you go back through these newspapers, you will see where shootouts, got a few of the people, but this many innocents, this small child was hit and dies, etc. These are happening on the streets. They're happening in places where people live. It's a crazy time. And that's the law of unintended consequences. While we can say prohibition achieved its aim of bringing down the liquor that's ingested on a per capita basis, and it's bringing down those accidents that are happening to the working man because he's now drunk and steps in front of a streetcar or goes to work hungover, drunk, and is pulled into the machinery. Here, because of these gang battles, there's ancillary problems. Now, I mentioned these people whose names I'm sure you've recognized, whether it's Lewis, whether last week I mentioned Hammett and Maltese Falcon, Chandler, because those are writing stories that to this day we still know. And remember, most of Hammett's stuff, his early stuff, was all based around labor battles between strikers and mine owners and things like that. So this all grows out of this time. Here's somebody you may not know, Josephine Herbst, a Sioux City girl. She went to Morningside College. She graduated in Sioux City. She went to Morningside College. She goes on to finish her last year in California, and then makes her way to New York so that she can get a job as a journalist for H.L. Mencken. We mentioned, very famous man. He had a magazine before he started American Mercury, which is lauded as one of the great magazines of all time. He had the Smart Set, which he started with somebody else. And Josephine Herbst became one of those people that was known, noticed, and became part of the gang. We don't talk about her today, and we're going to see why. But the Sioux City girl, goes to New York, gets in with the big names, will go to Europe and get in with the big names, and not just as being a girl, not much like the situation with the beat poets and the girls that they had on the side. This is truly, she's not there as a muse strictly. She is there. She will also be a writer. She will also be doing the same types of things they were doing. And being a writer, she's constantly writing back to her mother. When she gets to New York, she is shocked by the overwhelming number of poor people in New York City in excruciating poverty, as she says. That's a pretty big thing. And it's going to mark her for the rest of her life, because the entire time she's in New York, she's seeing that. When she goes to Europe, she can see worse. Now, Herbst is going to meet many of the same people that we've just been talking about, all of these writers that Schreier knew, that all of us have come to know. She's going to meet them. Some of them she's going to be a couple with. Some of them she's actually going to marry. But more importantly, she's going to become one of the writers. She will be one of the gang for at least a time. And throughout her life, she's going to inspire many of them. These 6 books you see are the prominent books she wrote before she fell out of favor. And we're going to talk about why she does. She wrote early on at this time that in one of the first books, she'd write, bottom had dropped out of the old world. It was a truism. The old men had not only bungled the peace, they'd screwed up the works. President Harding had been a stooge, and the highest government officials had been crooks. And Coolidge, lulled by the stock market, took long naps every afternoon in the White House. Disenchantment was not only a necessity, it was a joy. The lovely and beautiful became for our generation a term of contempt. The grounds of complacency held by our parents were despised. The sword of Picasso's analytic cubism ripped apart the stuffing, the stifling, overstuffed world of cushions and divans. She writes very much like many of them do. And during that time of those first books, she's turning that out. But again, we have that situation that the rules are slightly different for women. In what, in how abrasive they can be or how pushy. She refuses to recognize those and goes on to do very well. She has no problems from any of the other writers. Her problems will be that in her case, just as she was moved by what she saw as the inequities in New York City, when she goes on in life, she, like Dos Passos, would see things that would bother her forever. When you consider she went to the battlefields in the Civil War, and after she came back, she, that moved her on toward a belief that capitalism was not the best system. Even though after she came back, she would work, when World War II broke out, many of the writers proving their patriotism would go to work for a department that wrote propaganda for America, to be put out and put forth to convince others of the right of our cause, things like that. And she would be working there, but she would eventually be let go on secret whispers. She was never confronted on it, of being, in her past, she'd been a Marxist. Well, she might have told them if they'd ever confronted her that she was still a Marxist. It's hard to say. She had also situations where, she had started out thinking that there was no path forward in life, that it was fine for a woman to have affairs. As she would write, we would count them the way our grandmothers might have counted the linen. But of course, she had astonishing things that would happen to her in those situations as well, because of course women could get pregnant, especially in those days, and find out that things are not quite as simple or straightforward as you necessarily thought. She also, though, would end up, when all of this happens, she's not able to move forward in writing. She continues to write, but it does not go anywhere. By the end of her life, there are a few books that she will still put out, but part of those issues are she really becomes that nexus point. It's almost it's the equivalent. Something that was happening with writers at this time was they were finding areas and they would invite other writers to come in, and they would all share expenses, or like in her case, where she already had a house at this place in Pennsylvania, and would go forward and promote other writers and help them in their work as well. She, is a Sioux City native, and not one that we hear that much about today, but she has a body of work out there and a body of experiences that place her completely at the eye of the storm of what would become the late 20s, early 30s, and all of the things that are going to happen beyond that. She settles into that Bucks County farm in Pennsylvania, and you know, with it's not only, although her stuff is not necessarily selling, you know, she becomes a muse that helps others provide that. And I'm curious how many of you know anything about her. But we've moved up to 1927. We're about done tonight. We've got all sorts of things happening and things we're not going to talk about at great depth, but things from the Marines are sent into Nicaragua. This is one of those things that every time we think there's a escalation or revolution somewhere in Central America that we don't like it, we will send in the Marines and do so here. We've got the great floods in Mississippi, which will totally upend that area of the country and do a great deal of damage. We've got Stalin finally, you know, after having after the Russian Civil War has been settled, now we've got Stalin pushing Trotsky out. We've got Lucky Lindy crossing the Atlantic, and again, who's going to be there but William Schreier? So lots of things happening, and you know, to read Schreier's account of this is just fascinating, to see it and hear it through his eyes, and listen to, either read the newspaper dispatches. This is a fantastic thing that's happening. Remember, he's going over alone. And, you know, there have been people that had taken off not long before him that had died. There were still cases where some planes that take off with 2 or more pilots don't make it. Makes it 33 hours. There are people there that, you know, they've heard as he's crossed over, you know, Ireland and things like that, that, you know, they're waiting for France, and he will collect the prize. It's a huge issue. Now, remember, though, one of the things that truly, we talk about the books, but also remember, movies at this point are becoming the big thing. And this is a huge issue for those folks in rural America that are scandalized by some of these things. While some of the movies are great, there's a lot of things starting to happen with what they see as overt sexuality on the screen that just completely throws them away. And of course, here's Clara Bow, the original It girl, and that's why it's It. The movie's It. She has it, and you know, people like Buster Keaton will actually, you know, thrill and amuse and amaze people. But Rudolph Valentino, who, you know, absolutely, you know, captivates his audience. Same with Greta Garbo, you know, and this is one of those films that made her name, but the scene that we see the picture of here, you know, as he's making out with her, just absolutely takes the top off the Midwest as a scandal of morals, and one of the reasons why Greta Garbo is always remembered. Also remember, these are folks that are going to be around, but remember, all those were silence. But now, as we reach toward the end of the decade, we're going to have the coming of talkies. Wings, I believe, and Bill could correct me in this, but thinking, I mean, Wings is the original Academy Award winner, if I recall. But these people are famous, and of course, they transmit an interest and a belief in how great things can be or how bad things can be to all of their audience. Now, for as big as these people are, and we still know their names, although we may not really have seen many of their movies, here's somebody that came from that time period that I know you've seen him, and you've probably seen him since. He outlasts all of them. A guy named Mickey Mouse, auteurs by Walt Disney. And here's another one. She ends up getting banned, but of course, we do know her. It's Betty Boop, really a it girl in the cartoon, right? And the flapper and all of the other things, pursued by men and still known to this day. Now, I'm just mentioning, I've talked about all these highfalutin, literature books, but remember, you've got Dashiell Hammett, as I said, created Sam Spade. We're still reading those books and we're still watching TV shows based off the concepts that he made. And most people in the world can say they saw one of the versions of Maltese Falcon. But again, the scandalous vamp that I showed you earlier came from the original presentation of Maltese Falcon. It's quite a good story, but it didn't have the pizzazz that Humphrey Bogart brought to it very shortly thereafter. And my point to you through all this, much of what we know about the 1920s and how we remember it either comes to us from the fiction writings or a few of the movies that we've seen. It's the art and it's the time more so than the history of the time. And I mentioned Dos Passos earlier. His U.S. trilogy is still, very readable and very accessible to us today. So, well, I think what I'm going to do at this point is try to see if I can hit this. You should still be able to hear me. I would really like it if you unmuted to say that.
I can hear you.
Reached. Yay. So, it is 8 o'clock and we have reached the end of the program. Again, it does not want, oh, now it's going to freeze up. Okay. Ha. I didn't mention this earlier, but I just want to say it. Cal Coolidge's son had died shortly before during his actual elected term in the White House. And he said, for him, a lot of the good things in life went out at that point. In reality, he would issue a statement that says, and it came out in the summer of 27. The election is going to be in 1928. He issues a statement that I do not, it's just simple. It's so typical of him. No bombast or anything else. I do not choose to run for president in 1928. He's on vacation when he sends it out. So the election in 28 is going to be wide open. And of course, we know there is one person out there that has been in the White House now for 8 years as a person working in the cabinet. And, he's going to take on that case. But what he and no one else seems to realize is that time is really growing short for this moment of expansion that's happening in America. One of the things that comes down to us in history that the 1920s are one of the best years for incomes for Americans. Again, that's with half of the country not doing well because of the ag issues. But by the end, by 1928, what nobody realizes, textiles and coal and agriculture are all in trouble. Production is not really happening on almost any scale except in cars, except in small items. And that's the sales are the only thing keeping the economy going. Yeah, it says, come on. So it has locked up. I will ask, does anybody have any questions? Because it is 8 o'clock. We know who's coming. It's going to be Herbert Hoover. And as well it should be when you consider he's really the man of the hour And most everybody in the country knows him and knows him for all the great things he has done. And he has done great things and will do some great things. So, with that, next week, we're going to wrap this up. It is going to be 1928, 1929, which will take us to, the Great Depression. And, so that is it should be an exciting time, because one of the things I'm here to tell you, Hoover did a lot of great things, and he did try very hard to prevent the Depression as well. So it's going to be maybe some eye-opening pieces, and I hope you'll all be back for it. Any questions?
So you have in the chat, Russ, you've got Ed and Cindy said another great class time. Thank you. And earlier in the class, when you were talking about the KKK, I don't know if you saw the comment, but Joan mentioned that she saw a KKK uniform in the Adair County Museum.
Excellent, thank you. One of the things I'm hoping to do, as I said, it's funny, and I'm not sure what the situation is, but I can tell you about things in Iowa. I can tell you about things in South and North Dakota. I can tell you about things in Kansas. I'm not sure I can tell you about anything in Nebraska with the KKK, and I'm sure it's there. And one of the things I'm going to be researching over this summer is to find out for all of the states around here how much of that is happening. So
I can tell you, I was shocked when I saw that uniform hanging up in that museum. My husband and I and my daughter, we'd gone over there to see if we could find anything on my grandmother, who grew up in Adair County. The last thing I thought I was going to see was that.
Yeah. And again, it's a discussion that needs to be had. If you really think about it, we might not be at the situation we're at today if this discussion had happened anytime in the last 80 years, based on these issues, because we are right back to some of the same issues and some of the same discussions and some of the same belief pieces. And if we don't bring those out so we can talk about them, it's not going to change. And we're just going to roll it down the road for another bunch of decades. And that's not fair to anybody. So I appreciate you letting me talk through this. It's difficult to decide how exactly to talk through some of that on examples like this, but I'm kind of excited about this. I hope you enjoyed the class. I hope you learned something. Is there anything there that you heard that surprised you that we talked about?
Sorry to keep interrupting. Ed and Cindy commented that Ed had a relative in the KKK in the 1920s.
There we go. Exactly. And my point is that was not unusual. It was considered one of those groups. It was considered one of those groups you needed to join if you were going to get ahead. And there's such a story there on so much of that, and the problem is, this is that whole story piece. We accept that the KKK was in the South. We understood that. We all knew that. But we don't think about it being out where we live. That just can't be. So.
Yeah, I just want to, there's no family story on this. This guy, after he passed away, they found this KKK uniform, and it had a large red applique on it with a white cross in it up in his attic. They have no idea. The only thing we can speculate is because it wasn't where we would expect the KKK, because it was in Sanborn, Iowa, was possibly Catholic sentiment. There wasn't any other group up there,
Absolutely.
So
absolutely. And it was very interesting, because I had a history teacher that mentioned that when I was growing up, that he said, well, as a Catholic and as the son of an immigrant, of course, we you know, we were persecuted. We had guys show up outside the house with torches, things like that. They said they never did anything else. And they were all wearing hoods. And Dad would get so upset. I would say, why? And he said, because they're probably people I work with. They're people I buy things from. They are people we know. You know, that's why they're wearing hoods. And, you know, that it is a fascinating time to think about that, you know, that we don't discuss, that we've never worked through. So, you know, I think there's a lot there to that. And I'm sure he was not the only one in that region that was, you know, that had one of those in his attic. So, with all that, folks, I thank you. I think our time is up. If you have any questions, please tell me. If there's anything I'm doing that's annoying you, please tell me that too, because that's how you get better at this.
I think you're wonderful, Russ. I am going to go. I don't know if anybody has any more questions, but I do have to go. Have a good night, everybody. And thank you, Russ, for a great class.
Have a great night. I'll see you here next week at the same time. We're going to wrap this one up. Thank you so much, everybody.
Same time, same place.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.